Good evening and welcome to the PBSL Wellbeing session. This is our second session and delighted to say that I'm joined again by Rachel Fellows, founder of Wellbeing Consultancy Yoke. Evening, Rachel.
Hi, Tom.
And Ian Braid. Ian is former Chief Executive of the British Athletes Commission, amongst many other things, and now Wellbeing Guru, founder of Docia Mental Health, and consults widely on the subjects. Good evening, Ian.
Good evening, Tom. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Ian.
This evening, we're going to be following up on some of the subjects that we covered in our first session and looking at resilience. Wide-ranging topic, Rachel, and I'll ask you to start just as you reach for your bottle of water. Rachel, tell us a little bit about what resilience means to you and how it manifests itself.
I had to take a sip of water before that because it can be quite a long answer, can't it? Because I think it's probably one of the most overused words this year. I think there's definitely a sentiment that we all need to understand it and become more resilient. And I guess I find it quite helpful to break it down into three buckets. I think there are different definitions depending on if you're talking about your own resilience, your personal resilience, your team resilience. I'm assuming most people on the session tonight work within a group of people, and potentially even your organisation's resilience and how you might design yourselves to be able to cope with a year such as this year. But if I kind of start, Tom, maybe with the personal bucket, it's been quite an interesting one. And Ian, please chip in, but I don't know if you know where the word resilience initially comes from. It's actually engineering. And it used to be sort of a reference as to how much pressure can I apply on a metal before it snaps. And if we apply that language to humans, it can feel quite brutal, actually. We don't want to know how far we go before we snap, in particular in the workplace. But we've become a little bit more sophisticated in terms of how we evolve that concept, partly because of psychology, partly because of neuroscience. And now I think the dialogue or the general understanding for a human being is how able we are to bounce back from adversity. And actually what's become really, really interesting is that neuroscience is saying, well, because each experience changes us, we can't actually bounce back. If we're really smart about this, we might be able to bounce forward to somewhere that better serves us so that we can sustain ourselves through change. So Ian, how does that land with your thoughts? Is that roughly what you think resilience means?
Well, who am I to argue with you, Rachel? But I tell you a couple of things that resonate with me because I think I do regard myself as a resilient person, and there's two things that come out of that for me. I'm an instructor in mental health first aid, and in some of the training that we do there, they talk about people managing their stress container, and the stress container of any individual can vary in size at any point in time, depending upon what else is going on in their life, work, family, etc. And being resilient, and probably being smartly resilient, is managing that stress container so that it doesn't overflow. I had a bad time at the end of my stay at the British Athletes Commission because I was overwhelmed. It doesn't mean to say I was weak or I was at fault. It just was I was taking on too much, and I was taking up too much on my own. So I like your point about bounce back for two reasons, really. One is having had a previous episode of mental illness some 20 years ago. I remember Mrs. Braid saying to me, are you back to your old self again now? And I said to her, I'm sorry that you can't go back to what you were, having just gone through an experience like that. And I hope that I will learn from it and I will be different as a result of it. So I think that's very, that bounce forward is part of the journey, and it can either swamp you or it can redefine you. And, I'm not saying it was a good thing or a bad thing, but I was different after that episode, and I feel stronger and have a renewed sense of purpose having been through that episode the last time.
Ian, that's a really interesting point. How did you come back from that, and how do you start building up your resilience again once you've reached the end of your tether, if you like?
Well, I suppose one of the things is, uh, is I went to the doctors and I was signed off work, right? So that is somebody else saying, get off the bloody roundabout and start to look after you, start to look after yourself. So giving, it was enforced on me a bit, but it gave me time and space, and I needed that. And I think also in that time as well, I started to talk more about how I was and how I was feeling. And just that sharing of what was in here and dissipating it out also helped come back. And it was through those conversations with various people, other colleagues in sport or family or whatever, that it helped me redefine my sense of purpose again. I thought I thought I'd driven up a cul-de-sac because I had to leave the BAC, and I thought, I've come to the end of the journey here. There's no more I can do, and I've let my family down, and I've let 1,500 members of the British Athletes Commission down. But actually, it wasn't an end in itself. And it was through that conversation or conversations that one helped, and two started the kernel of an idea out of which DocuSport was born.
And Rachel, coming back to you, in terms of your advice to both individuals and organisations, how can we focus on building up our resilience if it's flagging a bit?
It's really interesting, and Ian, I'll try and kind of connect back to what you were saying, so sort of taking a few thoughts as you shared your personal stories. So thank you for that. I think what I observe when I work with people is that we haven't fully appreciated how holistic resilience actually is. And there are multiple different languages that we need to understand about ourselves to try and figure out where we're at. And even if you reduce it down to 1, 2, or 3, or 8, or however many languages, at a very basic level, we could look at mental, emotional, and physical resilience. And what's really interesting is often we almost place too much weight into one of those languages, so it almost overrides another. By way of example, we might think that we are mentally resilient, but actually we forget to listen to our emotional resilient or our physical resilient, that pain in the neck. I'll carry on working and I'll push on through, but it is the holistic relationship that's really important. And I think, Ian, maybe your story is sort of almost part of that jigsaw, is when we put too much weight into one area, we also become very attached to those conditions. So whether that be a job provides our resilience identity. So when that shifts or moves away, we then almost find it harder to recraft what that definition for us now means. So not only is it important to think about, how do I help broaden my definition of resilience, but also figuring out what conditions we have to support each of those pillars. By way of example, for me, I often use exercise or physical activity to support my resilience, but I'm also mindful that I can over-labour that point because, when I had Olivia earlier in the year, I knew I had to pretty much sit on a sofa and breastfeed for 3 to 6 months. And it was quite hard for me to find the space to go and do the things I normally did. So I had to figure out a way to really flip and be more diverse with how I approach resilience. So I guess my sentiment is, coming to a really kind of interesting time of the year as well, aren't we? But maybe reflecting on what things we overdo and what things we underdo, and how we might be able to create a little bit more balance with managing our resilience in a more holistic fashion.
And Ian, coming back to you, in terms of understanding how yourself as an individual operates, how do you generate that self-awareness to understand when your resilience is high, when your resilience is low? How do you develop that?
Thank you very much for a great question. I think one is over time. Two is not doing it on your own. I'll give you an example. Last Thursday, I had a really busy day, very varied and interesting topics. And I had 2 hours on the Zoom, then an hour off, and I piled back on again for another 2 hours of Zoom, right? And then there was an evening thing, an evening event that I was invited to online. And I just looked at this laptop screen and thought, I can't do this anymore. And I could have done it, but I knew that I'd reached my capacity for that day, and so I missed the last event. But it was, this is a COVID thing. I think I've got more general, broader self-awareness that I have started to be more honest with myself over time, and invited people to give me some feedback, honestly, over time. But this is a COVID sort of a thing, and it all builds on those foundations. This is like, I'm going to have to be very, very careful here, because if I have this strap line for the business, take and give care. If I don't take care of myself, I can't give care to anybody else, right? So yes, it was a shame I missed Thursday night, but I had a great Friday as a result. And I listened. So here's a catchy little phrase for you. I listened to a monk who knocks about with Ruby Wax. They go on tour. Upton, I think he's called. And he had a phrase he used in this performance he gave. Don't borrow from tomorrow. And I was in great danger of borrowing from tomorrow. And if you do that time and time again, then you are going to put all your resilience, however Rachel chooses to define it, emotional, mental, physical, you're just going to put it all at risk. Don't borrow from tomorrow. You heard it here first, or second anyway.
Rachel, same question to you. From an academic perspective, if you like, how do you measure and develop that self-awareness to understand your own resilience?
And again, I'll try and link it back to what some of the things Ian has said, and I like that phrase. I don't think I've heard it before, actually, Ian, so thank you. Written that one down.
Yes, it's yours, madam.
And I think what I kind of heard that hopefully speaks to both of your points is, Ian, you shared almost the process of stepping back. And I think what's really interesting is that in most of our life, we've been trained to be enduring, not resilient. And there is a fundamental difference. Mm-hmm. And endurance is that kind of classic British oak tree where I am strong and I will carry on pushing through. And it would have been Ian on, was it Thursday night? You would have gone anyway. And I think there's something in treating, in particular, our own habits and our routines in a fairly childlike fashion. And sometimes to take a handbrake turn and make the decision to not attend on a Thursday, we need to retrain what good feels like. And the first time Ian might have done that, it might have felt incredibly uncomfortable. But actually, over time, you can educate yourself that this is serving my resilience. I'm not borrowing from tomorrow, or I'm more able, therefore, to bounce back when something more drastic or more fundamentally changes in my routines. So I think this sort of dance between re-educating our own inner dialogue around endurance and saying, maybe that's not the most artful way, and actually thinking about it, because resilience is falling over, and it's saying, I'm on the floor, but how would I have fallen differently if I was to do that again? And only within that kind of stepping back process can you hear that. And it's quite an artful paying attention process. And I think what I found really interesting in the second lockdown, when I was asking people how they were, the general response was, I'm busy. I'm really busy. And I was trying to figure out if this is like a response to, oh my goodness, it's the end of the year, let's scurry around and try and deliver everything. But within that noise, it's really hard to hear what's going on for you. So if there's any way about creating either stepping back or creating some quiet, still time to honestly reflect about mentally, emotionally, physically, how you're feeling, I think it's a really artful skill to try try and create time for.
If I may, you just triggered a couple of thoughts there. One is this point about resilient is falling over. And when you fall over, not being afraid to ask for help. I think that's, don't do it on your own is what I would say. And I like your concept, Rachel, of endurance. What I was doing at the end of the bit at the BAC was I was enduring that role, which effectively means presenteeism, which means effectively I wasn't being effective or as effective as I might have been, and therefore it needed looking at. And the other thing that you just said, and I've heard it too with clients and out and about, yes, everybody's busy. I wonder also whether it's a smokescreen because people don't want to just get off the roundabout and have a think. It's smoke and mirrors.
I like that.
And I don't, and I think, and we'll come to it, I'm sure, in this conversation, but the 31st of December, turn the calendar page over to the 1st of December is a trigger for not necessarily doing more of the same.
And Tom, do you mind if I just add one more thing? Because I think it's really interesting, the endurance piece in particular in the sports sector. Because I think historically success has been about endurance. So I think there's almost more of endurance to shake off than maybe other sectors. I don't know if there's any kind of reflections on that from your perspective, Tom, but.
Yeah, very much so, Rachel. And what Ian was saying about his time at BAC really resonated with me because I can look back at times in my roles as a chief executive or in other positions and think, absolutely, I've been there, and I've been there because I felt I had to be there, but I wasn't probably doing myself any favours, and I certainly wasn't doing my organisation any favours because I personally was struggling. And one of the points that Ian raised in the last session that we did about the personal board, Ian, just take us through that concept again, and how important is it to listen to the people around you and develop that personal board?
Well, this is about, it came out of default, as in I got myself in a lonely place. The CEO's role is a lonely place. The state of my mind meant that I detached myself from my family, friends, etc., detached myself from a sense of taste and smell and all of this stuff, right? But it was only when I started to talk, and I always give Adrian Christie some credit here, the CEO of Badminton England, because to him, and he started to say to me, well, I know a number of people like you. So one, I'm thinking, I've taken some benefit from this conversation. Two, I'm not as lonely and as much of a liability as I was thinking that I was. And so the personal board for me has developed over a number of years, and it needn't necessarily do so for others. My son, Harry Braid, who sends his best regards to everybody, when I had my first hip replacement due to a career of long-standing journeyman sporting ability, Harry started to come with me on my little rehab walks, 10 meters one day, 15 meters, 20 meters, and it kept going. So Harry and I have this concept of, I could do with a boy's walk, Dad. And there's nothing off limits, and it's no eye contact, and it works. So, I worked with him. Adrian and I continue. I see things that he is doing online, or I read about him or whatever, and they give me a reason to put them a message. Board meeting. Item noted. IB says to Adrian Christie, well done, are you okay, etc., etc. So he's in. There's a neighbour who I've got to know very well during COVID, because he's a fundraising manager for Crawley Open House, a homeless shelter. And he and I walk. And we've both got a bit of a backstory. and sharing our relative or mutual vulnerabilities means we've had some really deep conversations, and he's become an anchor point. So there's not many people in my board. I have the privilege of having Baroness Tanny Gray Thompson on my personal board, because she was a great help to me all the way through BAC and so on and so forth. So it is diverse, and the in all governance structures, every board should have a senior NED. My senior NED is called Fred, and Fred the NED is my dog, and we have a interim board meeting every morning. But again, it's just with people or an animal giving me space to think and talk honestly and openly in a safe space, and I couldn't recommend it higher.
Thanks for that, Ian. Rachel, I want to come back to you on a point that you mentioned about sport and the culture within sport, because obviously everybody here is involved in the sports industry in some way, shape or form. Looking at the other sectors that you've worked across and your expertise working with different clients in different areas of commerce, how does sport compare in your experience?
From a resilience perspective, or almost from how sports approach resilience, or both?
A bit of both.
Yeah. It's an interesting one, because I think whether you kind of look at it almost as human sustainability, how do we sustain ourselves as humans? And I think within that mix, there's resilience. And I think within that mix, there's diversity. And there are other sectors that are far more diverse than sport. And we all know there's an issue around that. And there are great things we've been trying to have done that. But what Ian has just picked on is that accidentally, we can become quite narrow in our network. So whether that be the shadow board concept, or quite simply the mirror neurons, i.e. who we're asking to validate the thoughts that we have, or maybe even tweak them, we're often asking quite like-minded people. And I think, almost building on Ian's point, if I was to sort of say, one thing, find someone that has a fundamentally different life to you to start to talk about this stuff. To really challenge all of your assumptions that sit behind how I best manage myself and my resilience. So I think, starting from a place where diversity and resilience are very much married is a really important one. In terms of how resilient the sector is, I think there's a big question mark over that, because of, I nearly used the word, the excuse of the calendar. And I don't mean it's an excuse, but you have a very set rhythm. And within that, there is an element of, right, we go hard during an event and then we celebrate hard after the event. Oh, and then the next event starts. And in a way, often when those schedules are designed, we say, well, there's not space to recover. So therefore, we don't need to prioritize this. But actually, if that is your schedule, you need to be far smarter at how you sustain yourselves through that. Because from the outside, it looks relentless, but it doesn't mean there isn't creativity to be able to really dance within that schedule. And then hopefully the more enlightened sports also think about considering how they can design or curate teams based on rotating around different events or time zones or whatever it is. But I'm interested in the schedule piece that is often more pronounced in the sporting sector.
I think that's a really interesting point, Rachel, because you look at most sports and they're on a seasonal basis, and it is relentless. It's game after game or event after event. And there's the financial imperatives, particularly in an environment like we've got now. How can you convince people running those organisations, either at board level or senior executive level, that investing in your people and being a bit kinder to them in terms of their schedule is going to benefit and provide a return on investment, if you like?
Sorry, and I'll give you a moment in a sec, but in a way, because what you're recruiting at the moment is people who have experience in sport and are experts in their own field and have a passion for it. So that's what your skill base is. And that's not everyone. And that's quite a limited pool. So there is the argument that you need to protect the skill set that serves the sector. There's also another argument that you want to diversify that, but there's other organizations that we're working with, whether it be tech, for example, who rely on a very finite resource to develop what they're ultimately producing as a product. And it's not far off sport. So the whole premise is, do you know what? This has been a really tough year. Whether you look at the language used at Twitter, apparently it's the most negative language we've ever had. So the element of discontent or unhappiness is very much part of how we're all feeling at the moment. So within that, protect. If this is anything but let's protect and prevent burnout of the great people that we have, that's one way of looking at it. There are many different threads to the business case, but I think that's a really valid one at the moment.
Ian, you wanted to come in?
About 10 minutes ago, Chairman, I think. There's a couple of things again from Rachel's point of view. One of the things that I think has helped me is this guy next door, the home, the shelter man, because he's got nothing to do with my world of sport, and I think my resilience is being supported by the fact that I'm learning from him. It's a different lens looking at life. I think that's one thing. You talked about the seasonal calendar, Rachel, and you're absolutely right, of course. But above that, if you took the seasonal calendar as the weather, the climate that determines that weather in a lot of the sports I've been involved in is the 4-year funding cycle. And it is bloody relentless because 4 years goes so quickly. And I remember speaking to a PD who, a performance director who was fresh off the plane from Rio. And I said, have you got some time off? No, because I've got to do the 4-year planning cycle for Tokyo. It's not RE resilience, it's RE relentless. And it needs time out. And I think, I think sometimes there's a bit of an arrogance about sport and the sporting world that I was involved in that other sectors look to it because they say this is successful because we win a shed load of medals at the London Games, we do even better at the Rio Games, and we promised the world we're going to do even better at Tokyo before COVID took place. But if you lift the skirts up a bit and you say, that is success, but at what cost? And I don't mean exclusively in monetary value, I mean in human cost. Athletes that fall by the wayside, athletes that suffer as a consequence of their success, and I think sport should be more open and two-way in its dialogue and learn from other sectors as well. It isn't on the podium always, in my view, and a diverse thinking, diverse approach could go a long way forward to sustaining success with a slightly different definition.
And sorry, Tom, do you mind if I go again? You also provoke another thought for me, and I appreciate we've touched a little bit on meaning and purpose. And I think there are other companies I work with that are very leading in terms of their external mission is purpose driven. And often that attracts great talent. And that's often a story that we hear in the sports world. I work in sport because I love sport. But actually that becomes, if you're not careful, a really good excuse to overwork your workforce. There's a culture that's okay because they love it. So we'll slightly underpay them and we'll slightly push them harder than we would have done. And I think if we work in an area, hopefully this doesn't come across as controversial, but if we work in an area where we are fully in it, if I set up my own business, I am fully in this. I absolutely love what I do. But the art for me or any individual in our position is to separate a part of you from that world. So whether it be parenthood, looking after children, volunteering, but the separation offers you that broader sense of resilience as well, because the identity isn't all consuming, and therefore the roller coaster that you go on through these relentless cycles becomes more sustainable because you're getting nourishment from other areas of your life.
That's a really interesting point, Rachel. And one thing I'd like to ask you is, it sounds like resilience, which is the core subject we're talking about today, is heavily linked to motivation. And after a period, you can start to lose that motivation. I know personally that, in those relentless cycles that myself and Ian have talked about and experienced, it becomes the same old, and you start to lose that motivation. How can you recover that? How can you sort of reinvigorate yourself?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And why I giggle is because this is part of, Ian, Tom, you're facilitating this conversation, but this is part of when you feel unmotivated about well-being, yet you're trying to ultimately be an advisor on it. There's always a bit of a chuckle going on behind the scenes there, isn't there? But we are humans though, and I think your question always answers it. And if we purely look at the physiological resilience definition, it means equanimity between the stress that we have in our lives, the bucket that Ian mentioned he's filling, and then your ability to empty the bucket, or the balance with your recovery. And stress and recovery, when over a week, a month, a quarter, a year, almost evens out, is a sustainable way of working, of living. And I think, and I definitely feel, there's a direct correlation to imbalance in the equanimity and demotivation and disengagement. So my first port of call is to say, which one am I over or under doing? I place more attention there, and then the motivation and the engagement will naturally follow. I don't know if that's a useful way of looking at it.
Yeah, really interesting. I'd be really interested to get your perspective on that as well.
Well, for me, my motivation is around having a sense of purpose, which is not necessarily monochrome. And so, some actions I would consider taking or may recommend to others would be do something different, give yourself a challenge, learn. And it needn't necessarily be that what you do for your motivation has to come from a remunerated role, remunerated in financial terms. Anyway, I've done quite a lot of volunteering, and I've done enough in sport, but I've done it in other areas, and when you see people express gratitude for what it is you've done, I quite like that. And so showing and giving kindness in different ways could be that you get your motivation back. It's like kickstarting a failed engine, and it may well be that your motivation isn't sustained in that particular action, but it creates the energy for you to be motivated in, right now, I'm back on it again now, off we go. So, and let's remember the phrase as well in mental health terms, it's okay not to be okay. So let's not get too, overwhelmed and consumed by the fact that you're not motivated one day or the next day. Just do something different. We're all working from home. I'm able to come to this place, the Sussex Innovation Centre on the University of Sussex campus. And it's just doing, if I'm just sat at my allocated workstation by Mrs. Braid and I'm doing it day after day, and I think, you know what, I'm going to the sink tomorrow, just because it's different people, and you get a motivation in a different way.
Yeah, that's a really valid point, Ian. And I think one of the areas that we've discussed previously is about inertia and repetition, and it's breaking that cycle and doing something different. Rachel, is that something that you would endorse?
Absolutely. And I think there's some interesting conversations at the moment. Okay, apparently we have hybrid or flexible ways of working now. But actually, if we're all honest with ourselves, we're working in an even more monotonous way, because we just go to the corner of our bedroom or our study or whatever it is and sit at our desks, and that is what work now means. And even as simple as, what rules do I want to set for myself if it is a one-to-one conversation? Right, that's a walk and a talk, full stop. If I'm collaborating, I'm going to be standing up, maybe near a window, and I'm going to have my video on. And all of these, the different tasks that we do, we can create variety in the way, or even the corner that we stand, or the light that we receive, and whether we're spending time outside in nature. We always have freedom to design that ourselves. No one's telling us, because we're working from home, to do it a certain way. And I also think there's something in in your point, Ian, about, yes, gratitude. But again, in this kind of end of year pause point, we can also kind of be a bit more retrospective and go, wasn't that bad. There's some really good stuff that went on that year, and giving ourselves a little bit of a pat on the back, because it's felt so consuming and because we felt so busy, I think we've forgotten to almost take the good stuff from it as well.
I would strongly recommend, if people listening to this have had a good year or done some good things, then despite the cloud cover that COVID has brought to us, don't be afraid to recognize that and reflect on that. And perhaps linking earlier points, share those with your personal board. As well as it's okay not to be okay, it's okay to be okay despite COVID. And I think the variety point is good on any level you want to have it. If it comes to capacity, though, you've got you're spinning various plates. Let's make sure that the plates that you can spin, you can twist, you can keep going, and that you don't let plates drop and then feel overwhelmed and then back to square one. So variety is good, but in good measure in terms of capacity.
Excellent. We've had a question come in from Hayley, a couple of questions actually. First one, do you think there's a link to variety and motivations? Hopefully we've just answered that, Hayley. If not, submit another question. But the second point you raised, the business of sport is very much related to results and goals. Do you think this is helpful to building and maintaining resilience, or do you think it can be detrimental? Who'd like to go first?
I'm happy to, whichever.
I've got a book recommendation for you, but Rachel, you go
in,
first.
carry on.
All right. There's a book doing the rounds just now, written by a lady who you could either argue was successful because she's an Olympic silver medalist, or you could argue she was first loser because she didn't win a gold medal and she only won the silver medal. And I put only in parentheses, right? The book is called The Long Win, and it's written by a fabulous woman called Kath Bishop, who is an Olympic horsewoman. And it is challenging individuals to define success. What is success? Now, in the world in which I've spent a long time, some people's definition of success is only ring-fenced by medals. And that only looks at the contribution of an individual when they're an athlete. I think success is broader than that, and it's the contribution of the individual and individuals, collective in an organisation, that is beyond the bottom line, or it's beyond medals. It is about, in organisational terms, perhaps CSR and the impact that that is having, and the sustainability of that by bringing through next generation of people. So I think success is a very individualistic thing. And for me, it is, there's a mantra starting in sport about it's not just medals from the no compromise era, it's medals and more. Well, it isn't something new. If you look for it, it's happening already. It's happening, for example, in the sport. I sat at the gateway of the talent pathway for the sport of goalball last week, looking at young, clearly talented, the kids to me, right, 11 to 17, who would, not only were they playing goalball, aspirational Paralympians, visually impaired, they were already talking about, I'm coaching other people, I'm doing this, I'm doing that and the other, right? Now that is medals and more right here, right there. And that is a definition of success to me. Here ended the first lesson. Rachel, it's all yours.
I love that. Thank you. And I think my answer is almost a different story, telling the same story of yours, Ian. But my mind went to sustainability. I don't know if anyone's been watching the adverts, not necessarily the Christmas adverts, but there's a few adverts at the moment where businesses are being very bold with their environmental sustainability agendas. And there is an expectation now that if you're not carbon neutral or net zero come the next few years, you are an absolute laggard in this space. And I can quite easily imagine that in 3, 4, 5, 6 years' time, we're going to be seeing the same adverts, but with mental health, burnout, or well-being at the forefront. It's like, no, success means we're not burning people out. And the whole audit trail, conversation, dialogue, statistics that we present to ultimately our investors and our customers will start to be talking about this stuff. So I also agree with you, and I think performance has got to mean medals and more, or the high performance and the high well-being scenario.
I think that's a really interesting point that you make about sustainability, Rachel, because in our business, Kinsey Sears and Executive Search, we're finding that when organisations are recruiting leaders now, they're looking for people that aren't the deal makers or the rainmakers, if you like. They're looking much more rounded individuals in terms of their values, their culture, and how they're going to sustain the organisation, how they manage the people that are their resource, but also their stakeholders as well. And I think that's going to become more and more important as part of the sports industry agenda as we move on.
I agree, and if you don't mind just sharing one thing, but so typically, if you were to create a talent base, historically you'd look at the skills, almost the CV. Have they got the ability, the capability to deliver results or medals? In the last couple of years, we've gone, is that enough? I'm not sure. And there's been quite a lot of interest in the space of agility. That was supposed to be a question mark, hence the kind of wiggly line. What's coming next? The focus in the last few years has been on agility. So we have talent, but can they actually cope with flexibility, flexing themselves through change? Because the world is becoming more VUCA, or volatile, uncertain, complex, adverse. Now, that what this year has really thrown up is that enough? Is it okay that we're skilled and that we can flex? Because we can't sustain ourselves, or can we sustain ourselves? And that's where the capability of resilience has become really interesting. And so even some of the big insurance companies now are kind of saying, what tool do we measure this with? Because we think we've got tools to measure that and that with, but we don't know about the third point. So absolutely, I think you're going to be asked as talent, and especially if we're changing careers 6 times over our 100-year career cycle or whatever it is, it's not just going to be your CV. You're going to have to demonstrate how agile and how resilient you are. And that's a very much more of a personal, human, intimate story that we need to start to be able to tell.
I think there's a challenge for leaders here. I've learned a new phrase since we did the first wellbeing session, and I hope it doesn't travel into 2021, but you'll get the idea, which is reverse mentoring, and which I hate, right? But the concept I think is brilliant, right? Just because you are white, male, and pale and stale, as in my circumstances, I'm not speaking for you, Tom, clearly. But you know, good leadership is listening to other people and looking at things from their lens. And sustainability is about creating a space for the next generation to be willing to challenge direction of travel, and also when the time is right, say, right, well, here's the baton, my good man or my good woman, you run with this now. And I think, you know, particularly when you look at things, how things like gay rights have emerged, how the whole Black Lives Matter and EDI has evolved. I think people, you know, some of the great learning I've had this year is by talking to people younger than myself, and there are quite a few, obviously, but talking and listening to them about their perspective on equality, diversity, and inclusion, etc. And that if other people do that, will also help redefine what a sustainable definition of success is.
Excellent. Well, one last question to put to you both. Obviously, 2020 has been a difficult year for many people in many ways, not just the impact of COVID, but the fallout that's affected the sports industry in particular. Is now a good time to take stock of what's happened in 2020 and look forward to next year and look at how we can learn lessons from this year and plan for a better 2021 in terms of well-being?
Say yes, Rachel, and move on.
Yeah, we'll go with that one.
Listen, I think it is. Now you come back to this point about endurance that we had earlier. Just because something worked yesterday doesn't mean to say it's going to work tomorrow. And did it work as well as it might have done yesterday? So why take it into tomorrow? I do some work with an organisation called Switch to Play, and they which does a lot of work in athlete transition space. And in presentations I do with them or give them, we always talk about a 24/7/31 challenge. And what it is perhaps not necessarily, I wouldn't be so bold to suggest what you're going to do differently having listened to this webinar, but maybe what have you done differently listening to this webinar, or what as a result of reflecting, getting off the roundabout and thinking about how 2020 has been for you. What might you do differently in the next 24 hours, the next 7 days, and the next 31 days? Because if you do it and you challenge, write it down and challenge yourself, share it with your personal board so you're accountable, is all I'm trying to say. Right? If you do something by the end of the next 31 days, then funnily enough, you're into 2021 anyway, and it might start to become a bit of a routine. So have a think.
Great answer, Ian. I love that concept. Rachel, over to you.
Yeah, I love that concept too. I know. Where my mind went listening to you, Ian, was over the last couple of weeks, I've done quite a few graduate programs, almost virtually. How do we bring people who may have started in September, a couple of months in, start to sort of manage their expectations around what sustainable working looks like? Because usually how you end up working your first 1 or 2 years, you're still working that way 10 years later. So some organizations invest in that early part of the career. What's been really interesting for me that I was surprised by is I hear generalizations from the leadership level that the younger people aren't as resilient anymore. And there are certain countries or cultures that are even less resilient than the average, namely Asia. And from the global kind of graduate programs I've been doing, I would say there is a few myths to dispel on that one, because the way that the Asian graduates spoke to me and spoke of their practices and their thought around this stuff was far more advanced than some of the UK and US based graduates. So I think that's really interesting because there's something going on there where expectations have shifted, whether it be this year or not, but they have had that conversation with themselves. And I don't know how many of the people on the call manage teams, but I guess following on from Ian's point is if we don't prioritize this ourselves now, we will be met with conversations on the other side of the new year with people who are kind of knocking at the door going, no, come on. We now don't think this is a nice to have. This is part of what we expect. And I actually heard feedback of a little bit of anger. I heard the word anger, and we're frustrated that we're having this token approach again this year. How do we make it more strategic? So I completely agree with you, Tom and Ian, that it's time to reflect, but it's also with that hat of, gosh, if I'm leading, what new questions might come my way that I almost need to prepare myself for to answer going forward as the expectations are shifting culturally about well-being as a topic.
Great stuff. We've had a question in from Andy. They say a crisis is likely to reveal a company's true culture. If that culture is at odds with your own values and beliefs, would staying be a mark of resilience or a failing of personal integrity?
What an awesome question, Andy.
No, listen.
You want to go
no,
first?
No, please.
So I think there's a few things going on. in the sense that what this year, yeah, exactly, Hayley, what a question. So the last 4 big conferences I've been asked to speak at were all about transformational change. And COVID just happened to be a drop in the ocean of part of the change agenda. And I think there's something in this because it's about the relationship between an organisation apparently being static, and I joined because my mission was aligned to that static purpose. And actually the organisations are constantly dancing now and trying to navigate how to evolve themselves. And I think another organisation I've worked with, there's been this agenda around how do I co-craft or keep co-crafting my new purpose as the mothership changes direction. And I think part of it is reflecting if A, can I still slightly or fully align to the new mission? And if not, do I stay, or actually do I satisfy that other bit somewhere else? And that comes back to Ian's point around sort of almost the portfolio management of your life, is that when you separate out this stuff, sometimes it's useful to get maybe your integrity from one area and a sense of purpose in 1 or 2 forms from a few other areas of your life. Ian, I don't know if that kind of resonates with you.
This is a great question. Could you read it to me again? Because I want to make sure that I don't waffle. I give a good answer. I try and give as good an answer as I can.
Yeah, certainly. They say a crisis is likely to reveal a company's true culture. If that culture is at odds with your own values and beliefs, would staying be a mark of resilience or a failing of personal integrity?
I mean, how long have you got, right? But for me, in my personal experience, I felt that I was in an environment where 2 things. One, the focus was, the definition of success was medals, and the approach, and I speak in broad general terms, the approach was we need these things called athletes to win these things called medals. But I saw the athletes as individuals because they were very honest and very raw and very vulnerable when they talked to me. And I realized that it enforced my values about equality and giving and duty of care and family. And I was forced to leave by my mental illness. If I'd have stayed, then I'd have been there in identity, but not in terms of contribution, if you see what I mean. So, it's just a fabulous question. So my resilience came from, I thought that my world ended when I had to leave my role of athlete welfare. But in the conversation, and there we are again talking, and again with this guy, Adrian Christie, when he told me about other people with mental illness, and I thought, who's looking after the people, looking after the people? So I'm going to try and address the same thing, which is trying to work in the sector that I love and I'm passionate about, challenge it and try to have some form of influence in a slightly different way that is truer to my values. Now that's for others to say whether I'm being resilient or not. But it's just, I was forced to take time off the roundabout because I was ill. And I go again, and I do it in a slightly different way. So Andy, I hope I do your question justice, because it is just brilliant. And I shall be thinking about that on my dog walk with Fred tomorrow.
Andy,
yeah.
Great question, and it really resonates with
Andy.
me because I remember a situation where I found myself in a similar position and had to question whether me being involved in that organisation was good for the organisation, but also good for myself. And I think the lessons that I've learned as I've focused more on my well-being over the years and listening to experts like Ian and Rachel is that your first duty of care is always to yourself, because if you're not looking after yourself, you're not in a position to look after anybody else. So I would end on that point. Anything to add, Rachel, Ian?
No, take and give care. Take and give care. My mantra, your point. Don't look after yourself. You're no good to anybody else.
Well, that wraps it up for this evening. Thank you both again. I think some key takeaways for me. Best phrase I've heard for a while: "Don't borrow from tomorrow." Love that one, and I will bring that to bear. I promise. If anybody would like to join us in the new year, this is our last session for this year. So have a great Christmas, and we'll see you in the new year. There'll be a packed program in 2021. If you do want some additional wellbeing resource and you're a member of the PBSL, there's plenty there. There's a great video series from Rachel. There's a series of podcasts. There's some written resource as well. Don't hesitate to get in contact via the website if you need anything else. If you're not a member of the PBSL, obviously the question is why not? We look forward to you joining us very soon. So we'll leave it there. Rachel, Ian, thanks very much, and we'll see you again shortly.
Have a good one.
Merry Christmas.
Happy Christmas.